Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. This is our second event of the day, but the way that we do this, we usually have a very discursive dialogue anyway, so I have a few questions that I definitely want to get to, and then we will probably riff a little bit. But I want to at least start by mentioning that what's coincidentally very, very special about this event is that on February 5th of last year, it was the eve before this book was published, and Kristin and I did an event at the Seagramstrom Center in Costa Mesa. And it was an epic storm had just moved through Southern California. We actually weren't sure if we should cancel because we didn't know if anyone would show up. But we showed up, and so did 1,400 other people. And that was the moment when I looked out into this audience and thought, oh, I think this is about to be huge. And I'm not patting myself on the back. It was very clear that that was going to happen. This book has done, obviously, incredibly well. How many people have read it in this room? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So my first question to Kristin, we talk about this a lot because your career she is a publishing lifer. She has been doing this for a very long time and has experienced every up and down. And this is really surprising and an apex of success, but it's not, I know you, and I'm not going to say you're jaded by publishing, but you definitely have had your time there. So you don't quantify success by numbers of copies sold. What do you feel is the most successful part of this book?
Well, interestingly enough, when I used to speak a long time ago, I don't actually speak that much anymore. I get very nervous, but one of the first things I said to aspiring writers and to readers, that one of the most important things in writing is to define success for yourself, because everybody wants to define it for you. You have to be on the bestseller list. You have to make a certain amount of money. You have to publish so often. All of these various things that you have no control over as a writer. So to me, success is finding an idea and in time, and like before my deadline hits, and then spending the time that it takes to turn it into a book that I'm proud of, and I've written 25 books, so some are better than others, and now after 25 years, I'm an overnight success, and it's great, but I think the bottom line is I can't accept success any more than I could accept failure, because the point is really, this is what I do it to the best of my ability, I do it because I love it, I hope that people like it, but I've experienced, both sides of that coin, and so this one, I think what has mattered to me, and we were talking earlier, so at this event with the 1,400 people, which was amazing. I mean, I've done this for 25 years. I've had a fair level of success before. And, usually I'm lucky to get 200 people. And suddenly with the women, it was 1,500, it was 2,500. And that's when I realized that I think the Nurses of Vietnam hit a nerve, that I think it was a book whose time had come and a story that needed to be told. And I was lucky enough to be the one to tell it.
Well, let's talk about how you got to that story. Yeah. Go ahead. We're going to applaud after every single answer. That's just...
Okay.
So let's talk about how you got to this story, because you write in the author's note that you had this idea back in something like 1997, but was it just about Vietnam in general, or was it about the nurses specifically? How did you hone in on what this was going to be about, and why did it take so long?
So I pitched to my then editor in 1997, when I was 37 years old, that I wanted to write a story about the Vietnam era. And my editor, who had been at Berkeley in 1968, said, Kristin, I love you. You aren't good enough, and you aren't old enough, and nobody wants to read about Vietnam. And it was actually good advice on all three levels. And I think the reason that I wanted to write this book for so long I was a child during the Vietnam War, and my best friend's father was a fighter pilot, and he was shot down. And so, as you guys know, if you read the book, we wore these, prisoner of war bracelets, you too, and it had his name on it and the date he was shot down. And so I wore this all through high school and into college. So this lost soldier was a part of my, everyday existence for 20 years. And then, of course, a lot of my friends' dads were coming home from Vietnam, and I was seeing, how they were treated. And so it just left a really deep impact on me. I didn't really understand it fully, but it really mattered to me. And so I didn't know what the story was, but I knew I wanted to try to understand this era. And it wasn't until March of 2020, when we in Seattle were in lockdown, and I live on a small island. So when you're locked down on a small island, you are really locked down. There's no food delivery, there's no anything. And I was, watching the news like we all were, and seeing how divided the world was, the America was, how chaotic everything was. And it really struck me as a feeling of the Vietnam era again. So I think I started thinking about it then. And then again, in watching the news, I was watching the nurses and the doctors who were, on the front line of the pandemic. And it was pretty clear that, even from someone who wasn't in that world, that they weren't getting sort of the support and the, maybe gratitude is the word, but that I felt they deserved. And somehow at that moment, that's when the Vietnam era book became a book about the nurses. But I didn't really know anything, about them. I just assumed that there had been nurses in Vietnam. They were in every war. And so I started doing research.
So when did you feel, or did you ever have an inkling that this was going to hit a nerve in the way that it did, that this was maybe, because you did it with the Four Winds too, and I want to be clear about that. For people who don't know why I'm moderating this, by the way, I am an audiobook narrator, and I have narrated the last 3 of Kristin's books. So yeah, I did, thank you. So
amazing.
I had felt very viscerally when I first got the Four Winds to record that, again, just the timing of that, I mean, not that you could have seen a global pandemic coming, but that sense of, history is sort of repeating itself there is this huge humanitarian crisis, and people are going to have to figure out how to come through it together, if possible. And it dropped at the perfect time. And with this, when did you feel that this book was going to be the success that it was, in that it was going to allow people to finally talk about this subject that we'd maybe been avoiding for so long? Did you know when you were writing it? Did you know when you were editing it? Or was it publisher-led? Did they say, hey, we really think you're onto something here?
I knew as I was writing it, when I got into the research of the nurses and the story, and I saw all of the parallels to then and now that were, it took 3 years to write the book, so a lot of this was going on while I was writing it. So I did have a sense that it was potentially important. To see success or to know what something is going to do. I mean, like, for example, you talk about the Four Winds. As an author, when you drop a book about the Great Depression into a worldwide pandemic, you don't exactly think it's going to do well. I mean, you think this couldn't be a worse time, right, to do this. And so with the Vietnam War, we were all concerned, always. And so there was some discussion, do we hide it? Do we put a different cover on it? Do we, not let people know it's about Vietnam or war or, those sorts of things. And by the time the book was done, my editor and my team was pretty certain that, that it was a good book. And it wasn't really until Veterans Day of last year when Diane Carlson Evans, who wrote a book called Healing Wounds, which is fabulous. She was kind of my mentor in this process. She was an Army nurse who founded the Vietnam Women's Memorial. Anyway, she invited me to the 30th anniversary of the memorial. And she had given out the book to a couple of people, ARCs. They're like, early copies. And so I saw these women, these 70-year-old women, 80-year-old women, at their memorial together for the first time in, some of them in, 40 years. And they were crying, they were hugging, they were telling their stories at a microphone. And one of the women, the nurses, came up to me and said, she gave me a big hug, and she said, "This book is going to start to heal us." And that's when I went, oh my gosh, maybe this is more than just a novel. And I think that's what it is. It's really, it's a story that needed to be told, and I've seen so many families who are now asking their parents, their grandparents, their siblings about these stories that have been untold for a long time.
And I think giving people credit when we weren't giving anyone any credit for anything they did in that war, but specifically, obviously, the women who were very lost to history. And in fact, at the event that we did at the Performing Arts Center, someone stood up and had said, there's some Vietnam nurses in the audience, and pointed up to the box back here, and you and I both just went, what? And immediately started sobbing, and then the entire room got on its feet for a standing ovation, and it was incredibly moving, and it's that through line that you're talking about. But when fiction transcends its original purpose of entertainment or information and actually just plugs right into that nerve center that everyone, that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
So when you were researching this, because I think as a writer, I'm always fascinated by the research process and where you decide, like, what is that inciting incident that makes you think, ooh, there's a story here, this is what I want to talk about. Was there something in the research that jumped out at you that you said, I didn't know that? Or what was the most surprising piece of research that you came across?
Well, I researched for a year, and I would say there was a continual moment of surprise. What these women survived, what they did, their service, how they were treated when they came home, all of it was really pretty surprising. But the thing that I guess sort of shocked me the most was in my research, I kept coming across the sentence, there were no women in Vietnam. And I didn't want to put this in the book because I thought to myself, that just can't be true. I mean, that's got to be hyperbole. Nobody said to these women there were no women there. And, because we know Florence Nightingale, we know nurses in World War II. There have always been nurses in war, right? And MASH was on TV. And so I just thought, this can't be right. And then when I went to the memorial, I met all these nurses, and I talked to them, and I said specifically, were you ever told there were no women in Vietnam? And almost every one of them said yes. That, when they had gone for help, when they had, whenever they had tried to assert their status as veterans, they were told that there were no women there, and, look for help elsewhere.
I remember when I read that in the book, I actually texted you saying, like, this didn't actually happen. Like, you can't no one's going to believe it. And that's one of those things where the standard for believability in fiction is so much higher than believability in life. But you did it. Speaking of that, we did this last time, and I would like to, if you would indulge me for a second, I want to read a section that's specifically about this. And I always, at this point, say, Kristin, would you like to read?
And I say, I don't read next to Julia Whelan. Thank you very much.
Okay, which is very sweet. But
by the way, I have to say, if you have not listened to her audiobooks, she is just amazing. Not just with my books, but really a talented.
Well, okay. Thank you. It's easy when the books are like this. So I recorded this probably a year and a half ago. And the reason why I want to read this specific section, I love that all the hands went up, so this isn't spoilery. Usually I can only get away with reading from the first few pages of books. But this women were not in Vietnam thing has stayed with me since I recorded, and I think about it I think about this scene at least once a week. So just a quick reading here. Frankie, this is once she's home and she decides to go to the VA for help. Inside, she went to the front desk, where a large woman in a floral-patterned polyester dress sat in front of an IBM Selectric, her scarlet nails clacking on the keys. "Ma'am," Frankie said. The receptionist paused in her typing, but didn't move her hands away from the keyboard, then looked up. "You in trouble, darling? Is your husband angry?" Apparently, the sunglasses weren't much of a camouflage. "I've heard that you offer therapy for Vietnam vets. Oh, there's a rap session at 10. Why?" "Where is it?" The woman frowned, pulled a pencil out of her big hair, tapped it on the desk. "Down that hall, second door to the left, but it's only for Vietnam vets." "Thanks." Frankie walked down the hall, past several men sitting on molded plastic chairs. At room 107, she saw a flyer taped to the textured frosted glass panel in the top half of the door. "Vietnam veterans, share your stories with each other. Rapping helps." She took a seat, waiting, staring at the clock. Her whole body ached and her head hurt, and she felt sick to her stomach, but she didn't move. Her left wrist throbbed. She looked down, saw a bruise blooming on her pale skin. The door in front of her opened at 9:55. A few men walked into the room. She paused, tried to calm herself, and then she got up, opened the door into a small windowless room in which folding chairs had been set up in a circle. Several of the chairs were occupied by men, most of them Frankie's age or younger, with long, untended hair, big sideburns, and mustaches. A few older, grizzled-looking guys sat with crossed arms. More men stood over by a table, eating donuts and pouring coffee from a tall silver urn. Frankie had expected to be the only woman, but she still felt uncomfortable as one by one the men turned to look at her. A man approached her. He wore a checkered shirt and cowboy jeans held up by a huge buckled belt. His long frayed hair flipped back from a center part. A huge mustache covered most of his upper lip. "Can I help you, foxy lady?" he said, smiling. "I'm here for the Vietnam Veterans Rap Therapy Group." "Yeah, it's groovy that you want to understand your man, but this is for veterans only. I am a vet. A Vietnam. I am a Vietnam vet." "Oh, there were no women in Nam."
Yeah.
"Wrong. ANC nurse, 2 tours, the 36th and 71st evac hospitals. If you never saw a woman, you were lucky. It meant you didn't end up in a hospital." He frowned. "Oh, well, you should talk to other chicks about whatever. I mean, you didn't see combat. The men would clam up with a woman in the room. Are you telling me I can't stay? I have nightmares and I'm scared. You won't help me?" "You don't belong here, ma'am. This is for vets who saw action in Nam."
You know, it's interesting. That's something that's been with me for a while, because even before this book, I wrote a book called Homefront about a female Black Hawk pilot that deployed. And I remember in doing the research and talking to her, and this was probably maybe 15 years ago. I lose track of time. But she flew a Black Hawk, and you know it was during the war, and she would fly in to pick up troops that were being trapped by enemy fire, right? So she would land or not land, but you know, hover in, and the troops would get on the helicopter and she'd fly them out. And her comment to me was, "But we're not in combat." And I remember thinking, what do you mean? Well, we don't get combat pay, we aren't combat, we don't hold a gun, therefore it's not combat. And this argument is obviously, it's still going on right now, actually. And so part of the reason that the Vietnam War section was so visceral and so relentless in this one was because I wanted to express, you know, my human opinion that if you think this isn't combat, you're not paying attention. And, you know, of course, women who go through this are going to, you know, or not all of them, but some of them are going to have some issues. And I talked to a male Vietnam vet, and he said the thing that was so interesting was the nurses when they were, in the hospitals, it was nonstop horror, over and over and over, 24/7. And so that they had a lot of times even worse issues, but no one to recognize it and no one to help them.
Absolutely remarkable. Let's actually talk about the writing of it. So the novel is broken into two parts. Part one covers Frankie's origin story and then her time in Vietnam and her mostly disastrous initial return to civilian life. Part two picks up 2 years later, so it's 1971, with the nascent anti-war movement, which brings everything that Frankie has been trying to suppress back to the surface. Did that structure, was that there from the beginning, or did you find that as you were testing your character, fire testing her and saying, what does she need to have happen to her to grow from this? What is the character arc? How did you settle on this?
I would love to say that I knew this from the beginning and that I'm really a genius and that I can see it all and sit down, but that isn't really my process. I wish it were. And it certainly wasn't the process in this book. This book was always about the Vietnam War. I mean, that's what I wanted to deal with. But I came very quickly to the understanding that I didn't want to write just a war novel. And so I like to say that the book took 3 years. It took 1 year to research, 1 year to write the wrong story, and then 1 year to write the right story. And in that middle version, it was not about her coming home to this extent. It wasn't until I sort of got deep into all of it and knew Frankie and sort of owned the research that I understood that it ultimately wasn't a fair representation to do the war story without doing the coming home story. But the challenge was, you've got the first half of this book is just, nonstop, relentless action, essentially. And so then you have to figure out a way as a novelist to make sure that the second half isn't just boring in comparison. And so I put, poor Frankie through some difficult times. She still likes me.
Yeah. A hard-won victory, but she did it. Actually, this is going off script a little bit, but now I'm curious, because you had a similar kind of, from what I recall, your experience with Four Winds was similar in that the central relationship was different than the one that you ultimately ended up writing about. Mm-hmm. And from a publishing perspective, I really want everyone to appreciate the fact that authors are so pushed into these days being on a book-a-year contract, having that system is in place. Everyone wants you to churn. And to be fair, the bravery that Kristin has to be able to say, it's not right yet, I'm going to go in and I'm going to keep writing. And if it takes another year to write the right book, that's how we end up with books like this. Not because the publisher says, but you're going to miss your window. So I just really appreciate you, and I appreciate Macmillan for saying, when it's ready, it's ready.
I agree. Thank you. And you know how that started, honestly? So with the Nightingale, as she pointed out, I wrote, 20 books in 25 years or something. And I was on a book a year. I was a stay-at-home mom, and this is what I did. I wrote novels. And when I started writing the Nightingale, it's like the women. I knew instantly this is a really important idea. This is a story that all women should know, and I don't know it, and I read a lot of historical stuff. But I don't really think I'm good enough to write it, So I waited a few years for someone else to write it. No one did. And so I finally said, okay, I'm going to write this. And I was contractually, I had 1 year to write The Nightingale. And I'm very OCD, and I'm a former lawyer, so if I have a deadline, I hit my deadline. And so at about the 5-month mark, I called my editor, and I said, without her having read a word, I said, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is the Nightingale can really be something special if I don't screw it up. And she said, that's great, that's good news. And I said, the bad news is I can't do it justice in a year. So you have to decide, do you want, an okay version, or do you want to give me whatever time it takes to make the, to write the right version? And bless her heart, she didn't miss a beat. She said, take as long as you want. And when you sell a lot of books, that's a big deal, to say, we'll take you out of the schedule for however long. And as a writer, you never know if people are still going to be waiting for you.
Yeah. Especially time moves so fast now, and there's always some new shiny thing, and the market is oversaturated, and all of the reasons that writers give themselves for, no, but I gotta get something out immediately, and I love that. Let's talk about, first of all, the title. I want to know where the title came from, but mainly that's because I want to talk about the two friends who cropped up in this book, and you've said before that actually you think this book is about friendship,
right? Really.
So how did you come to Barb and Ethel? Because they have nothing in common with each other, and they also have nothing in common with Frankie. And they probably wouldn't have met if they hadn't been put into this circumstance together. But you have Barb, who is black from the segregated South with a Black Panther brother, and who has legitimate grievance about who is doing most of the fighting and dying in this war. And you have Ethel, the white farmer's daughter from Virginia, who follows her sweetheart over to Vietnam, and he dies and she's there. Mm-hmm. So how did these two characters come to you?
It is so interesting too, because to me, this is a novel about friendship. Strip everything else away. It's about the power of women coming together and saving each other and themselves, over and over. That being said, I didn't see that one coming either. This was to be Frankie's story. And the reason that I picked Frankie and one character was the only way that I could even hope to manage a subject as big as not just the Vietnam War, but America during this time period and all of the division, was to put it all through one character, to tell, a singular story. And so I began writing her. And it wasn't until I got to, I don't know, it's chapter 6 or something, where she lands in Vietnam. And I've got my research out, and I'm like, okay, now she goes to her hooch, which is this little, shed-like thing that they live in over there. And that's when I went, oh, I need two women. And that was the moment. I thought, okay, who are these women? And, I just tried to pick, like you said, 3 differing points of view so that I could talk a little bit about the country and the changes and what was happening through them without having to tell their stories completely.
And did the title come out of that conscious decision of, I really want this to be this is about friendship?
No.
Oh.
That would be smart too. No, actually, the title of this book was impossible to come up with. I mean, we just kept trying and trying and trying, and because we didn't want to make it sound like a women's book. We didn't want to make it sound like a war book. We didn't want to hit you over the head with Vietnam, at least in the beginning when we were, trying to come up with titles. And so I have a team. It's my editor, my agent, and myself, and we kind of text each other things back and forth. How's this for a title? How's this for a title? And at one point I got, semi-irritated, and I just said, why don't we just call it The Women? And my editor said, that's a terrible title. Nobody will buy that. What women? What are the women doing, right?
We need a verb.
That's right, where are they? And so I said, okay. And so we kept going. We kept looking for more titles. And then I was working by this time with Diane Carlson Evans, who wrote Healing Wounds, this amazing memoir about her time in the Vietnam War. And I pitched this title to her. I said, this is, I think, what we're going to call the book. Kristin, this is a terrible title. And she wrote like a half a page on why it was such a terrible title. So what I love about Diane, she was very opinionated, and I always got her full on. And then she signed it, One of the Women. Oh. And so I thought, oh, Diane, maybe this is the title. And so I pitched it again to my editor and my agent. I said, look, this is what happened, and I think this might be the title. And they said, I just don't think so. I just don't see anyone buying it. And then that night at about 11 o'clock, my editor texts me, I have an idea. The next text, the missing, the forgotten, the brave, the women. And I got chills.
Yes,
And I went, okay, that's it. That's the title. But I do get in trouble for some people are upset that it's called The Women and it's about a woman.
People are tedious.
Social media.
Social media. Everyone has an opinion. And it happens to be wrong. Okay, so and speaking of the women, I think that we've talked about this before, but the novel does such a good job of testing our preconceived notions of morality, because you take Frankie from a young woman of the 60s to a woman of the 70s and the 80s, and the changes that happened at that time and the changes that she was specifically a part of are so massive. And she starts out as this woman who's been taught to believe a certain way and to have a moral imperative that is coming from her social standing, her class, her religion, and then you throw her in a war. Mm-hmm. Probably the most immoral situation that someone can be in. And we watch her become someone who makes moral decisions we don't necessarily agree with and make immoral decisions that we can understand. Can you talk about what, for you, if that was a conscious thing of watching a woman try to understand whether her morality had been constructed for her or whether she was defining her own morality?
Well, I mean, I think I chose very specifically that she was, from a well-to-do family, that she was a religious family. Her parents were from the greatest generation and considered themselves, very patriotic. And so that she went to war thinking that she really knew what was right, what was wrong in any given situation, and that she wanted to be the woman who did the right thing in every situation. And then, as you point out, you put a woman like this in war, and not only is she trying to assimilate and to understand and become a better nurse because she had no business being there. She's also coming of age, from 21 to 24, so she's also growing up. And the important thing to me, I think, was to show that in the great scheme of things, in my opinion, Frankie was courageous and she was heroic. There are readers that disagree with me on this, but that's my take. And it was important to me that when Frankie falls to her knees in the second half and hits rock bottom, it's not solely the PTSD, it's not solely the war. What breaks Frankie is that she broke her own moral code. She did something that she knew was wrong, and she did it for the wrong reasons, and it so, I think, shook her sense of who she was, that she then, sort of plummeted. And what I liked about that, and we've talked about this before, in literature and arguably in life, women are not really allowed the full range of human emotions. We're not allowed sometimes to be selfish, to be cruel, to be ambitious, all of these things that are considered a negative. And I think it's important that we don't try to have all of our women all the time be sympathetic and likable. Because I think the human experience is more complex than that. But I do think, for me personally, morality is important. I mean, she can do the wrong things, but she needs to know it, and I think she needs to pay a price for it, which she did.
Yeah, she did. But there's a complexity there. I mean, even to the extent, which I'm so glad it's finally been like a year and we can talk about Rye without having to go spoilers. Oh
no.
But what I love about what you did with that character is you put the theme of the book in his mouth.
Yeah.
The thing that starts it all is women can be heroes too. He's the one who says that. And yet, it transcends him. It's a bigger point, and it's a better point than he will ever be.
Yes. And you know, you never know who's going to start you on your path, and you know how it's going to begin. Now, I could give you a Lord of the Rings quote right now about how dangerous it is going out your front door, but I won't.
We'll get there.
I've got one for almost every occasion.
We'll get there. Okay, so we're gonna pivot very briefly to just talking about books, because I like to do this anytime I have an author that I'm interviewing. But do you have a favorite character in the novel?
In this novel?
Yeah.
Frankie.
Okay.
I mean,
Well, you could have said, like soldier number 4. I don't know.
yeah. No, I mean, I would say actually in all of these years, at this moment, Frankie's my number one character of all time, followed by Vian in The Nightingale.
Yes.
And then, and you guys may not have read this, there is a book called Magic Hour that's very old, and there was a 6-year-old feral child who I loved.
I love it. Speaking of The Nightingale, there is a 10th anniversary edition of The Nightingale that is floating around. I think if you have it, lift it up. It's really beautiful. It's got sprayed edges, and that's what they actually have. And there we go. Ta-da!
Yay!
Very
thank
pretty.
you.
Anything else going on? Because there's always movie news with you. Anything you can talk about or update people on?
Warner Brothers is full steam behind the women. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And I will say a lot of really great actresses are saying, hey, I'd like to be considered for this. Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Yeah. That should be an embarrassment of riches. I would hope so. Okay. What do you hope, as we've said, success comes and goes, but this will be a book. The reason why we all write books is because they will live on a shelf long after the success has burned off, usually, hopefully even long after we're gone. So what do you hope that someone who picks up The Women in 10, 15, 20 years, what do you hope they take away from it when it's no longer the most popular book anyone is reading and, it doesn't have that glow on it?
Well,
What do
that glow is lasting for decades.
Yes.
I think one of the most, I guess, rewarding parts of this book is a lot of millennials and Gen Zs are reading it and, coming up and talking to me, and they literally know nothing about the Vietnam War. And so I think that anytime any novel or work of nonfiction can open the door to a different time and make you feel connected to that time, because it's really hard, I think, to read The Women and not make some connections to what's going on today politically. It has a lot to say about that in a lot of ways. And so I guess I would hope that as time goes on, it would continue to be a glimpse into this turbulent time in American history, which, by the way, we came out of. So that's an important point.
Well, we're going to need you to tackle this current climate of division. When do you think people are going to be ready to read a book about this?
Well, I think there's a lot of people here right now that are bringing books. I mean, I'm looking at the list.
Well, not the nonfiction people.
Oh, the fiction people.
Yeah.
It's a scary thing. It's a scary thing in the world today. So I wonder when is pandemic stuff going to... It usually waits 10 years.
That's true.
Who would read a book about the pandemic?
Yeah,
right
that's
now?
actually curious, because every publisher that you talk to will say, someone will say, I wrote a book about COVID, and publishers will be like, we're not doing that right now. Would people read a COVID book yet?
No, it's too close to home.
It's too close, yeah.
Okay.
You got to get some
they're
perspective.
right? I don't want them to be right. Okay. All right. Okay, to wrap up, a quick 5, which is just about books, and this is for you all to take as recommendations. So, what's the book that made you a reader?
Lord of the Rings.
Don't say it defeated. It's a classic for a reason. It's a classic for a reason. I will say, because this came out in the last session, and I think this is important to point out, She is a fantasy fan, which I think a lot of people maybe don't expect from her. But one of the things that she tied together for me in that is that by reading so much fantasy, she's exceptional at world building. And this kind of painting the world, making it feel immersive,
That's it.
is coming from that training.
I don't believe I used the word exceptional with
No,
regard
sorry,
to myself.
I editorialized that. That was,
But, yeah, I think it really is the love of fantasy, big fantasy, and I'm a big horror fan, I'm a big thriller fan, and I think all of that it finds its way into my writing. It's very, I write a very immersive book.
Yeah. What is your favorite book?
The Lord of the Rings.
Okay. What's a book that you think about often? You only get to say the same book twice. What's a book that you think about often that lives kind of rent-free in your head? Not necessarily your favorite, not necessarily the best, but you just find yourself thinking about an odd amount of time.
Huh, okay, well, since you've, you know,
sorry.
hamstrung me here.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with The Shining.
Oh, wow, wow.
Didn't see that one coming, did
No.
you? Right?
A specific part of it, or?
Oh, always.
I mean, I just loved it. You know, Stephen has a way of doing children in peril that even though he's older than I am, not by much, but he's older than I am, I so relate to his children and to, you know, all of that sort of stuff. And I was a real outsider kid. I moved around a lot, 4 high schools, 3 junior highs. And so it was books like Lord of the Rings and Dune and The Shining, and these were the books that were my friends, you know, that I took these people around with me in a schizophrenic kind of way.
Yeah.
Really.
So that's all right. Some kids had imaginary friends. You just had fictional friends. What are you reading now?
I'm reading the new Isabel Allende. And actually, I have the new Taylor Jenkins Reid on my desk, so I'm very excited to read that one as well. That's the one of the best parts of being a writer is you get stuff early.
It's good. Which book do you wish you'd written?
Pat Conroy, The Prince of Tides.
Yes.
Great book.
That is a great book.
I wish.
That is a great book. Anything else? Like, you're not talking yet about what the next project is, but it seems there is something happening, so you can at least assure people.
Well, I don't know how not to write. I mean, and in fact, a couple of years ago, when a close family member got cancer, I took a year off and just didn't write at all. And I couldn't have made a worse choice because writing is my happy place. You know, I'm in full control. When I'm doing it, I think I'm brilliant, and nobody's telling me what to do, and I'm sitting, you know, mostly on my back deck with a yellow legal pad just creating, so I love that. So I'm always writing. I don't always write a good book, and it can take me years to take a decent idea into a good book.
But we're with you on that journey. We will wait. As we just said, we will absolutely wait.
I
Kristin,
appreciate
thank
that.
you so much
Oh,
for
yeah.
being here.